Hey everyone! We've talked a lot about how Illustrator is our vector editor and Photoshop is our raster editor, but in this video we're going to take one look at one of the special features in Photoshop that's actually based on vectors, and that's clipping paths. Creating a clipping path is a non-destructive technique of creating a closed vector path or shape using the pen tool in Photoshop, and it's very popular for photographers who work with very complex composites. Essentially, a clipping path gives us the ability to remove the background from any image. Now, up until this point, we've done that pretty exclusively using layer masks, and you might be wondering why you can't just use a layer mask. Well, you might be bringing it into a program that doesn't support transparent layer masks. If this is the case, a clipping path is your best solution. Now, when we look at InDesign, which we're going to learn about in a different course, you'll realize that InDesign does support these layer transparencies, like you see here. But it also plays very nicely with clipping paths and has a couple of nice little features if you make a point to use them. And the last thing to keep in mind is that sometimes, even if the transparent part of the image displays correctly on your monitor, it still might come out wrong during a printout. And again, that type of problem can be solved by creating a clipping path in Photoshop before you import to InDesign or Illustrator. The steps to creating a clipping path in Photoshop are create a path, name the path, choose the path, and save it as a TIFF. So you can see in my window here, I have my Layers panel active and also my Paths panel. Paths in Photoshop are very similar to paths in Illustrator in the sense that they are anchor points with handles and the line segments between. And additionally, they can be drawn and manipulated with the pen tool and its related tools. As you can see, I hit P and I have access to my pen tool, a freeform pen tool, a curvature, add anchor point, delete anchor point, and convert point tool, which are similar to what you are used to seeing in Illustrator. There's a couple different ways to go about creating a clipping path in Illustrator with some ease. So again, if we're working with a really simple file like this tomato, I'm going to remove my layer mask before I start this. I'm going to use my contextual taskbar to just select the subject, which is going to pull the majority of the tomato here. And then in my Paths panel, I'm going to hit the flyout menu and hit Make Work Path. The tolerance here is going to range really dramatically depending on the result that you're looking for and the thing that you're trying to clip out. I did some playing and found that a tolerance of 1.5 got me a result I was pretty happy with for this tomato. And you can see it gives me a whole bunch of anchor points that really nicely conform to the contours of this organic shape. So if we go back to our list, we create a path and then we name the path. We name it by double clicking on it and naming it. I'm going to call this one tomato and hit OK. Note that it's no longer a work path and it actually has a name. And then the next thing we do is, while it's highlighted, we hit our flyout menu and we hit clipping path. We hit OK. And you'll notice that there was a very subtle change where the text now looks bold. I'm going to do File Save just to make sure that I have this updated. And then we're going to see that update in InDesign. Note that the transparency is still showing up, except this time it's showing up because there's a clipping path, not because there's an actual transparency. So let me go back to InDesign, and I'm going to do one more change here, so that you can see some of the neat things we can do with this. If I wanted to say take my text and wrap it around the shape of the tomato, I can tell it to reference the Photoshop path. And now it's actually wrapping solely to the contour of that tomato, which is kind of just a neat feature to be able to take advantage of. Another interesting thing that clipping paths let you do in Photoshop is have multiple paths that InDesign can then select between. So I'm going to quickly make a second path and show you what that means. I have the text tomato here, and I'm going to use a similar method to what I did when I was selecting my tomato, but instead I'm going to use my magic wand with contiguous unchecked, and I'm going to select my white text here. I'm then going to go to make work path. This one I had better luck when I went down to 1 pixel. It's now labeled as a work path. I'm going to double click it to name it as tomato text and hit OK. And then I'm going to turn off my text layer so that the path is there all on its own. Note that this path doesn't actually have any type of appearance to it. It's just an aspect of the file that InDesign is going to be able to read later. So I'm going to save my file. Now note, my original tomato layer is still the clipping path I have selected, but we're going to see that change in InDesign with a neat little thing. So I double click and I've updated my file. Now, if I want to update this tomato to reflect the other path, I just go to Object, Clipping Path, Options, and then change it from tomato to tomato text, and see how my file updated accordingly. I could then tell my text wrap to reference the tomato text instead. And I have a completely different result, all while being completely non-destructive and not having to mess around with transparencies in any way. I'm going to go back to Photoshop now just to show you what that final piece looks like. So we have our tomato with the tomato path selected now. I can click again and select my tomato text instead. And always remember that when you are working with clipping paths, you want to make sure that you save your files as TIFFs. In addition to TIFFs being able to support multiple layers in Photoshop and save all of your settings, it's also a file format that's capable of having both vector and raster data in the same image, which it makes it particularly versatile when we're doing something like this, where we're switching back between Photoshop and InDesign. One other way to pull a path into Photoshop is by having something that you actually created in Illustrator. I'm going to hit Command C and then hit Command Tab to switch over to Adobe Photoshop, and then making sure that I have no layers selected and no paths selected, I'm just going to hit Command V and tell it to paste as a path. And now it shows up as a new work path. I'm going to rename it to be Star, and now we have the option to have that be our clipping path. I'm going to just resize this down. I hit Command T to give myself the free transform tools, and I'm just going to quickly move it to fill the whole tomato. I'm going to hit Command S, hit Command Tab twice to get back over to InDesign, and then double click to update. Go to Object, Clipping Path, Options. I can now select my new one, which is Star. And I could tell my text wrap to reference Star. And that is how you go about creating clipping paths in Photoshop.